Is defending Bakhmut the best strategy, and could Ukraine break the impasse with the new weapons? These and more we'll discuss with my next guest, Dr. Marina Miron, military analyst, postdoc researcher at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Pleased to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kyiv and Moscow are both suffering heavy losses as fighting intensifies in eastern Ukraine. The commander of the Ukrainian forces says the situation in Bakhmut remains difficult, but Ukrainian soldiers are managing to repel Russian attacks. Why is defending Bakhmut the best strategy right now?
Well, first of all, we have to look at the military logic of doing it. And General Zaluzhny made the case that if Bakhmut were to fall, the entire defense line of the Ukrainian forces would collapse. It would be a colossal loss for the Ukrainian forces. And given the fact that Ukraine has committed so much manpower to Bakhmut, it would be a waste to leave it now to the Russians. So if Ukrainian forces had retreated earlier to save more manpower, then maybe it would have been less painful. But right now, with so much on stake, leaving it is not an option, according to Zaluzhny. And I think President Zelensky agrees with that. Western officials doubt that decision. And we also know that General Syrskyi said that it's a way to make Russians lose more men, because, as you said, both sides suffering heavy casualties in Bakhmut. So the idea here is to win more time and to make the Russians lose more manpower. And another side of this whole story with Bakhmut is that the Russians, from the very onset of the second phase of their special military operation, wanted to use Bakhmut as a springboard to go towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And so the problem is that they will most likely be using Bakhmut for that if they manage to take the city. And we're also seeing reports that allegedly Russian forces might be trying to reconnect because they're coming from the north, from Liman. So they might want to kind of close this distance and reconnect with a grouping in Bakhmut. So there are kind of a lot of speculations of what the Russians might do. But in the military sense, of course, it would make sense to save Bakhmut. And apparently we have heard that there are reserves being deployed to the front line. We know that Chasiv Yar is still under Ukrainian control. So the situation is very, very difficult. And, we cannot predict what is going to happen now because, Wagner is claiming that they're about to close the pincers. So the idea of Kesselschlacht is what they're doing in Bakhmut. On the other hand, Ukraine is deploying more forces. So there is a hope that this attack might be halted, and once the Russians kind of reach the culmination point in their attack and run out of steam, that the Ukrainians would possibly be able to launch a counteroffensive if more forces and more capable forces are deployed there.
Yeah, that does make sense because the pace of Russian operations in Ukraine has decreased and the Wagner offensive on Bakhmut is approaching its climax. At least that's what the American Institute for the Study of War thinks. So do you agree with this assumption, and what's going to happen next if Bakhmut stays under Ukrainian control?
Well, that would be a huge loss for the Russians because they are also betting quite a lot on Bakhmut. Obviously, you remember at the very beginning of the second phase, the Russians were holding Izum, and so the idea was to keep Izum and to keep Bakhmut in order to be able to further move to the western part of Ukraine, to move to Kharkiv, to move to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And now, if the Russians lose Bakhmut militarily, it would be a huge setback because their initial plan will fail, so they won't have this possibility. They will have more difficulties to supply their troops as well because they are also interested in controlling the highways, which run on the western side from Bakhmut towards the north. And so that's kind of in the military terms. But in political terms, this will be even worse for the Russian side because it is kind of a symbolic victory as well for the Russians. And Putin, after so many military setbacks, has to show something. Now that we know that General Gerasimov is kind of creme de la creme of the Russian military, is in charge of the special military operation, and he has to also deliver something. And the setback in Bakhmut after this whole loss of manpower and equipment would definitely destroy the morale, which is already suffering the morale of the Russian armed forces.
Every single day, we hear lots of news concerning the supply of Western weapons to Ukraine. So when can Ukraine break the impasse with its new weapons?
Well, right now we know that some of the Leopards have already arrived, the Leopard 2 tanks, and we also know that the crews are being trained in Spain and in the UK. They are being trained to conduct combined arms operations because that is necessary. You cannot just integrate the tanks into the current system. They have to be combined with mechanized infantry, with close air support and kind of, anti-drone measures. And so the Ukrainian forces have to be prepared to use them as a part of the system. That being said, some estimates say that it would be around beginning of May, end of April, when we will be seeing the rest of the tanks, because they have to be refurbished in order to be used in Ukraine. And obviously the crews also need to be ready, because it's quite different from old Soviet prototypes. Both Challengers are different because it requires 4 people, the tank crew, as opposed to 3 people, as in T-72, for instance. Same with Leopards, and also other things have to be kept in mind because of the weather in Ukraine and a lot of mud. Some other kind of equipment needs to be supplied together with tanks, such as bridge layers, and in order to be able to cross rivers. And so all these things need to be trained. And so we are hoping that it's going to be sometime end of April, beginning of May, or when Ukraine can see the tanks. But the bigger issue is 125 millimeter ammunition rounds for artillery, and that might take a little bit longer.
Yeah, and talking about the long-awaited counteroffensive of the Ukrainian army, let me just quote something about and some thoughts by my colleagues, journalists from Washington Post. So, the quote: "The quality of the Ukrainian military, which was previously considered a significant advantage over Russia, has deteriorated after a year or so, and they doubt," the journalist from Washington Post, "whether it's possible to start the counteroffensive in this case in May this year."
Well, I have heard similar statements by my colleagues from other institutions. Basically, the whole point is that Ukraine has also lost a lot of capable manpower. And so the issue here is the newly mobilized, and we know the mobilization is going on right now, are not as well trained as those that Ukraine has lost. And now we're coming to the people that are being trained abroad. So the idea of this counteroffensive is to have those newly trained soldiers spearhead the counteroffensive in conjunction with newly mobilized. But it is a difficult kind of mix, because I remember General Zaluzhny, I believe, was saying that we shouldn't forcefully have people sent to the front because they demoralize the armed forces. And so there is this kind of issue when it comes to the difference in skill level.
There is one more threat from the Russian army I'm talking about the plans to mobilize 400,000 people from Russia. What do you think of it?
Well, I think the problem is that even if that goes through, and I think Putin has to be very mindful, because in order to justify mobilization, he would need to show something and to show some progress. And I'm sure the kind of the information machine in Kremlin will make sure to convince the people that there is a need for that mobilization. But that being said, if he doesn't win, or the Kremlin doesn't win Bakhmut, it will be very difficult to justify because of the high losses and because of how the Russian MOD doesn't even kind of report. That's why we're having Wagner there, and some of Wagner fighters who spoke to Western media said that they had to literally move over the corpses of Russian forces to make their way forward. And the other problem is the training, because training takes time. So you don't want to have newly mobilized people on the front who have no idea what they are doing. So it's more of a peril because they can endanger the safety of those operating in Ukraine. So it will take a lot of time, maybe 5-6 months before we would be seeing, I mean, Russia mobilized in September, and only now we're kind of starting to see the people that had to be trained, they were attached to units in order to be able to be sent to Ukraine. So I think it is possible for Russia to mobilize, and I think at a certain point Putin might try to do that, but I don't think that we will be seeing anything soon. At least it will not coincide with the counteroffensive that Ukraine is planning, because they just don't have the time.
Ukrainian officials says that there is a possibility, and it's quite high, that Ukrainian army can liberate Crimea in summer 2023. What is your personal assumption about that?
Well, a lot of that will depend on many factors which are not necessarily connected to the capabilities of the Ukrainian army. It will depend on the weapon supplies from Western allies. And we know we have this huge delay with tanks. You know, remember when Poland pledged to send tanks and when the first tanks actually started arriving. And so I think for the Ukrainian army, it would need both capabilities and equipment. And Poland now said that it will send MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine, and those would indeed be useful for such an operation. However, we have to speculate here, assuming that the counteroffensive would be taking place somewhere in Zaporizhia direction Melitopol in order to mess up the logistics for the Russian forces and to get to Crimea. If the counteroffensive is somewhere else, then I don't see how that could happen. So we have kind of a lot of ifs here and a lot of moving variables. And of course, the Russians are preparing for that. And the last place they want to lose is Crimea. So it would be a huge defeat for Russia. So I think they will be fighting to their last man to defend Crimea, because out of all territories that they annexed, that is kind of the most painful one. In geostrategic view, it gives them access to the Black Sea and to the littoral, and not just from a military perspective, but also from the economic perspective, because it has a lot of oil, so the sea shelf. So the Russians don't want Ukraine to become independent in sense of being able to not buy any energy from Russia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the answers and the insights. Dr. Marina Miron, military analyst from King's College London, was the guest of Spotlight Ukraine. Thank you one more time. Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Latest news, trends, and analytics on all about Ukraine. Like, share, and subscribe. Any questions, proposals, and comments, contact us via email.